Hello and welcome to Pro Wrestling Repackaged. I'm Chris.
And I'm Tessa.
And we are now in the lead up to Season 1 of Young Rock, which will be the focus of the first season of our show. So today we'll be giving our thoughts on the first official trailer for Young Rock and discussing our expectations of the show as well. But first, we thought we'd tell you a little bit about us and what you can expect from Pro Wrestling Repackaged. So we've both been wrestling fans for quite some time. We actually met because of wrestling. So Tessa, why don't you start out with a little bit about yourself and how long you've been a wrestling fan?
So I've been into wrestling for 20 years or so, give or take a few. My oldest brother, was a fan during the Attitude Era. So it's always been kind of around. Wrestling has. He had a lot of VHS tapes. He'd watch Raw, and I'd be in the living room while he was watching these things. So a lot of my early memories are Attitude Era, 1998 type things, because he had all of those home videos. It's probably the reason why I'm a little afraid of Mick Foley, because of Three Faces of Foley.
That's a good one.
But it wasn't until 2003-ish that I started watching it on my own. By that point, my brother wasn't really watching anymore, and I didn't know anybody who watched wrestling. So it wasn't until I started getting active on Twitter and Tumblr in around 2010 that I found a community and was able to interact with other wrestling fans. I had more people to talk to, so it kind of grew my fandom. And this is when I was able to learn more about other promotions, because up to that point, I pretty much only knew WWE and TNA. So I started learning about Ring of Honor and New Japan and my personal favorite, Dragon Gate. And that kind of launched us.
Yes, that was the official launch of us, yes. Well, I mean, before we get into that, like you said, wrestling is just more fun when you have someone to watch it with and talk about it with. So for me, getting into wrestling at about 7 or 8 years old, I was introduced to wrestling by my cousin Matt, who we had just moved on to the same block that my cousin lived on. And he was a huge wrestling fan. He's no longer a wrestling fan to my knowledge nowadays, but at the time he was such a huge wrestling fan and he just indoctrinated me into everything. So like as soon as I moved onto the block, it was immediately just boom. He's showing me VHS tapes. He's got all the action figures, the video games, the magazines. And I was just entrenched in this world of 1997, 1998 WWF, which was about to be just red hot. Austin just at, the full peak of his powers and The Rock coming into his own. So the Attitude Era definitely launched a lot of wrestling fans really at that point, that big boom period, and us included. And really it's interesting that we kind of both got into wrestling around that time. We're 5 years apart in age, both got into wrestling around that time. And then we both found our way to a company like Dragon Gate, which is actually how we met. So I guess we're technically a wrestling couple because we met on Twitter, both live tweeting Final Gate 2016 on Christmas morning, the early hours of Christmas morning in 2016, like 5, 6 a.m.
As you do. Totally normal.
Totally normal. Totally normal to do. And
is that not how everyone meets?
That's how everyone meets their significant others, yes. So we met live tweeting a Dragon Gate show. We started interacting and then pretty much never stopped talking. There's probably hasn't been a day since, maybe a month after that. And we've been together for 4 years now. And that's kind of why we wanted to do this podcast. We are big wrestling fans, but really we're not too engaged in the actual product right now. And that probably has a lot to do with just everything going on with the pandemic and everything like that. Lack of crowds, just lack of interest in general. I mean, there's been a lot of seismic shifts happening lately in the wrestling business, but we haven't been watching it too much. But what we have been watching, we watch a lot of shows together. That's one of our favorite things to do, right?
Yeah, we watch, all kinds of nonsense.
All right. So I'm taking offense to this immediately because most of these shows nowadays are my suggestions, although you have indoctrinated me into things like Gilmore Girls and Bonanza and all of your favorites, which...
Bonanza's the greatest show of all time.
Okay.
So that's just
agree
facts.
to disagree, and we will actually have reason to talk about Bonanza at some point on this podcast, but that's another story for another time. So we've been thinking about doing a podcast for a while, and we watch a lot of shows, and a niche that we have kind of fallen into is shows that are wrestling adjacent or wrestling related, and it's been more of a trend over recent years where this is becoming a thing ever since Glow. Some shows have been greenlit, particularly Young Rock, which is the focus of our first season, but also Heels, which is the upcoming Stephen Amell show on Starz, where that's all about a wrestling promotion, and he plays a wrestler in a wrestling family, not unlike the Rhodes family. And then there's also things like the Big Show and this upcoming Disney Channel Blue Demon show, which sounds just absolutely amazing. I'm sure at some point we'll be discussing all of those on this podcast, but that's really something that we wanted to hone in on, this kind of niche of wrestling related TV shows, because we're watching them and we're interested in them. And, you know, that's to say we're not experts and we don't intend to present ourselves as experts on this subject. We're just wrestling fans who enjoy watching wrestling be repackaged, if you will, into other forms of media and entertainment. So that brings us to what you can expect from this podcast going forward. So each season of Pro Wrestling Repackaged is going to be focused on a wrestling-related show, such as the ones that we've mentioned.
Yes, I can't wait to talk about the Big Show.
and this is where some of you may be saying, well, wait a minute, the Big Show is not a show about wrestling. Well, that does not disqualify it. So it is not a show about wrestling, but the Big Show is the main star of it, and he plays the Big Show. And his wife refers to him as Show. It is something, let me tell you. And
it features former professional wrestlers. They are guests.
Exactly. Yeah, there was an episode with Mick Foley, Mark Henry. So that is on our list for sure. You know, we mentioned Glow, we mentioned Heels, and anything else that happens to pop up over the next few years or so. I know The Rock does have another wrestling-related show in development with, I believe, HBO. So The Rock definitely has his hands in a lot of these pies, but it's very interesting. No pun intended. No pun intended. But so that'll be the main kind of bread and butter of what this podcast is each season we'll be taking a look at a different wrestling related show.
And shows that just have wrestlers as guest stars.
Exactly, because we do also plan to do themed seasons where we discuss, for example, wrestlers appearing on episodes of a sitcom or comedy or like an action drama like Walker, Texas Ranger, or an animated show. You know, there are so many instances over the years of wrestlers just popping up on these other shows. And I, for one, always just found that really fun. You're watching a sitcom and all of a sudden Triple H shows up.
Me watching Bernie Mac with my chicken nuggets in the basement and Stone Cold Steve Austin is suddenly there.
With your chicken nuggets. Oh,
yes,
man.
Of course.
So themed seasons kind of based around wrestlers on sitcoms or wrestlers on action shows or dramas or animated shows, maybe even reality shows, maybe even some Tough Enough. Who knows? If it's a wrestling related TV show, but it's not actual wrestling, it's not like we're sitting down and reviewing Raw or SmackDown or AEW or something like that. That's kind of where our interest is. Talking about wrestling that's repackaged into something else.
So that means 2 seasons of The Surreal Life are on the table?
Absolutely not. So whenever there is a break in either the programming of the show that we're watching or we are just in between seasons ourselves, we'll also be doing some bonus content that'll be wrestling-related movies or documentaries. So think Beyond the Mat, think Wrestling with Shadows, any of the classic wrestling documentaries, anything noteworthy like that. Maybe even some old WWF home videos. Between the two of us, we have a collection of those.
Not Three Faces of Foley.
Why not? Don't you want to see Mick Foley sitting in the upper rafters of Nassau Coliseum with the Hardy Boys talking about his career?
That was
Don't
there?
You want to relive that? Yeah, was at the Coliseum, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't want to relive him attacking JR, as I said. Afraid.
Classic vignettes.
Fear.
So that's all on the table right there, and maybe even some wrestling-related music and music videos. Of course, many of you may have followed me over from my old podcast, Music of the Mat, which is now hosted solo by Andrew Rich. I actually recently appeared on Music of the Mat for the 4th anniversary show to discuss the Big Show, the themes of the Big Show. So that's Music of the Mat is a podcast dedicated entirely to the music of pro wrestling, another niche that is very near and dear to my heart. So I used to do that with my buddy Andrew. Now he hosts it solo. So definitely go check out Music of the Mat on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network if this is kind of your vibe, wrestling-related media, music, things like that. I would definitely recommend checking out Music of the Mat. It's really an awesome podcast. So season 1 of this podcast, as we mentioned, will be dedicated to Young Rock on NBC, which debuts on February 16th, which, as we're recording, is just a few weeks away. So our first official episode, will be released just a few days after that, and it will, of course, be a review of the Young Rock pilot. And we will be reviewing all of the episodes of Young Rock the week that they air. So a few days after Young Rock airs, either the Thursday or the Friday, we haven't decided yet, You'll be getting an episode talking about that week's episode of Young Rock as long as season 1 goes. There's no official episode count as of now. IMDb has it at 11, but a lot of those are just placeholder episodes. So we'll see. I'm expecting maybe around 12 or so. But we do know that, there's the first season order, and then beyond that, the future of Young Rock, whether it gets renewed or not, we will continue to follow each show that we cover. If it's currently on the air, we'll continue to follow those shows as they air and do our best to kind of program our show around any of the shows that we're covering. But for shows that are kind of binge shows on Netflix like Glow or The Big Show, those will be kind of in between anything that's coming out or airing live or anything like that. So we'll have to be a little bit strategic in how we program and how we do our seasons. But ultimately, I think it'll be kind of a fun examination of just what's current in wrestling-related fictional media or nonfiction if we do some reality shows, things like that. But yeah, it's a fun niche, and I'm excited about the amount of wrestling-related content coming out now, and just the fact that wrestling is being accepted into kind of mainstream entertainment a lot more. And it helps to have a figure like The Rock kind of spearheading a lot of this, because obviously he's one of the biggest stars in the world. He's the biggest movie star in the world, I think.
I mean, the fact that I think there's a bunch of people who probably don't even know that he's The Rock. They just think of him as Dwayne Johnson.
Well, that's true as well, and it's interesting, The Rock for so long was The Rock, and everyone on earth knew who The Rock was, but now he's kind of just morphed into being just full-time Dwayne Johnson, part-time Rock. So it seems like Young Rock will really be The Rock kind of diving into his wrestling roots and, his family, and really exposing a lot more people to that part of his life that people might not really be, except for wrestling fans, people might not really be privy to. And so speaking of Young Rock, the official trailer for season 1 just recently came out. So we thought we'd take some time to kind of break it down and give our thoughts and expectations for the show. But first, just kind of some thoughts about The Rock in general before we really dive into the trailer itself. I mean, The Rock being the time that we got into wrestling, obviously a big presence in our wrestling fandoms, I would imagine.
Well, The Rock's never really been one of my guys. And I think that's because I started majorly watching in 2003, and The Rock's presence started kind of declining at that point. He's always been there, but he's never really been one of my absolute favorites. I like The Rock. I like everything I've seen him do. I think he's funny. The promos are great, albeit maybe a little problematic in these times. But
well, yes, with the benefit of hindsight, there are certainly a lot of aspects of The Rock's character that would not fly today, and rightfully so. And I think he'd be the first person to tell you that. But so around the time that you would have been really, really getting into wrestling, he would have been coming off of the Hollywood Rock character, which one of my favorite periods of The Rock. Personally, I mean, I just had the leather vest and pants and the
shaved head
and the Rock concert. Those original Rock concerts. When he tried to do it years later, it wasn't nearly as funny. But those original Rock concerts, I thought were just hilarious at the time.
I don't know. I had a good time when he was doing them later. Maybe it's because I was younger than you.
Well, that's true as well. Because when he did come back and was feuding with John Cena and things like that, it was a little bit underwhelming for me, just because it just seemed like kind of a different person. Like, there's not much Rock left in there. Like, this is full-on Hollywood star Dwayne Johnson. This isn't really The Rock. And so I've been kind of feeling a little bit disconnected from The Rock just in general in recent years, over the last decade or so, because he just doesn't seem too much like The Rock anymore. I mean, you go back and you watch that really charismatic guy in 98, 99, even 2003, and there is just something there that just feels off when he makes his more recent appearances.
The worst thing is my biggest memory of The Rock is actually not really The Rock. It's DX impersonating the nation. So it's really Triple H as The Rock.
Yeah, talk about a segment that in hindsight you go back and there. Yeah,
I've seen that a billion times.
Yeah. I mean, those were really popular segments to just download on like Napster and Kazaa. Those were the days when there wasn't YouTube, so you would be on these file sharing services like Napster, Kazaa, LimeWire, just downloading clips of old funny wrestling promos. And there were a lot of Rock promos that I had downloaded from back in the day.
Well, we had it on a VHS. It was like
That's
Best
true.
of Raw is War, 1998 or something like that. So it's just constant rewinding.
Yeah.
That part.
The Rock had a few of his own home videos from back in the day. And I'm sure at some point, especially since it's relevant now for season 1, I'm sure we'll do some bonus episodes taking a look at those, because I have them. I'll just have to get my mom to mail them out. But yeah, potentially something that we could take a look at in the future. But yeah, I think we're both kind of in lockstep here that we enjoy The Rock, the concept of the guy, and we enjoy him as a person and certainly as a performer, but he was never our favorite. But if he's involved with something like this, where it's about The Rock and he's not just playing some generic action star, I am into this. I am into what I am seeing so far from young Rock.
Yeah, because I'm never going to actively seek out a movie starring Dwayne Johnson. No. It's totally not my thing. I mean, I like, bad movies.
Well, if you like bad movies... I mean,
his movies aren't even necessarily bad. He's like the hugest star for a reason.
I don't know. The last Rock movie I think I saw was The Game Plan, which was a Disney movie where he plays a football player named Joe Kingman.
Joe Kingman.
So maybe at some point we'll take a look at that as well. I don't know. What was the last Rock movie you've seen, if any? Have you seen any Rock movies?
I don't think I've ever seen a Rock movie.
Okay, interesting.
Actually, I don't think I've never seen him act in anything.
Interesting.
Besides.
Okay. So this
The Rock.
So this is all brand new territory for you then. I've seen a few of his movies. I've seen like maybe 10 minutes of The Scorpion King before I fell asleep. I've seen The Game Plan, like I mentioned. I've seen Walking Tall, which I remember liking, but have only seen once. So potential for bonus episodes of us taking a look at some Rock-related movies. But young Rock really, I think, appeals to us on a few different levels. And just some high-level thoughts before we break down the trailer. First of all, I'm a sucker for periods like the 80s and 90s. I'm just a sucker for those periods in general. Just the look, the aesthetic, the music that you get. I enjoyed the fact that throughout this trailer, they had Get Down on It by Kool and the Gang playing at the beginning of it when they were first introducing you to the concept of here's young Dwayne Johnson. So I like that a lot. And I just think that this trailer really alleviated some of my fears about what this show would be. When I first heard of the concept of young Rock, I turned to you bewildered and said, there's a show called Young Rock coming out. And we laughed, and young Rock would kind of be like just a joke that we would just throw about. Oh, I wonder if Young Rock is still happening. Just kind of joking about young Rock. And then all of a sudden, oh yeah, here's a release date. Here's a trailer.
Well, and they also, what was it, at the Macy's Thanksgiving parade, they had the big balloon of him with the turtleneck and the fanny pack.
Yes. Which leading into those aspects of quote unquote young Rock is exactly what I would hope and expect for a show like this. So I am all on board. After seeing this trailer, I am all on board with this show. I think that first of all, the trailer was funny. It seems like a funny show. It also seems like a nice, heartfelt show.
Yeah. It's very much about his family. He seems to be a very big family guy and comes from a big wrestling family. So
family really was a big takeaway from this trailer. And we can start to dive into it now. And we start with some Dwayne Johnson career highlights. We start with the myth of The Rock as we know him now, Dwayne The Rock Johnson. And then we have this voiceover from Dwayne, or can we just call him The Rock?
He's The Rock to me. I will never.
So I think when we're reviewing the show, when we refer to The Rock, we're talking about the current day, or in 2032, current day Rock, who is running for president.
2032, because it does not take place in today.
So when we refer to The Rock, that is who we are talking about. When we refer to Dwayne at any various age, we are talking about his younger self before he has actually become The Rock. So I think that's just how we'll establish that. So we get a voiceover from The Rock that says, "To understand me, you have to understand where I came from." And really setting up the entire premise of the show that he's running for president of the United States in 2032, and he has a Lex Express tour bus that has him with his arms out on the side of it.
It moves.
A video playing on the side of the tour bus, and it says, "Just hang on, I'm coming." And I guess you have to wonder at that point what the political climate is in the US in 2032 for The Rock to have to come in and do the run-in and save us all in the 2032 election.
I mean, people would vote for him too. People say all the time they wish The Rock would run for president because they really think he could do something. I don't know what. I just think a wrestler would make a good... he could be, rock bottoming dignitaries and world leaders, and, we'd get a lot of stuff done. He has such a strong presence.
Well, clearly that's all you need. So The Rock is being interviewed about his campaign by Randall Park, who is playing a journalist who is, quote, given all access coverage to Johnson's presidential campaign, interviewing the candidate throughout the season and letting audiences and voters better get to know the possible future commander-in-chief. And that's from the Entertainment Weekly article about the casting of Randall Park, as well as Rosario Dawson, who we will get to in just a bit. And this is where we really get a glimpse of the storytelling premise that they will presumably be using, at least for this season, which is The Rock reminiscing about his younger days in this interview. I don't know if it'll be a season-long interview, and each, little bit that he brings up, that's what the episode is about, that particular story, that time in his life. I don't know. Will they be jumping between time periods? All things that are still kind of question marks for us at this point.
Yeah, that's what I'm mostly wondering. Will this be chronological at all? Will we just see The Rock acting as a narrator this whole time, as this overarching figure telling us the story?
It seems like kind of how they're setting a little bit of this up with, later in the trailer, we see all three Rocks side by side, or all three Dwaynes side by side. Sorry, this is going to be hard.
Just call them Pebbles.
Yeah. Well, the show should have been called The Pebble because it's a small rock.
This is how we're going to have to differentiate. We don't want to call him Dwayne.
The Pebble, yes. So we see young Rock number 1, or young Dwayne, the 10-year-old version in Hawaii. And The Rock talks about how he was born into a wrestling family, which then leads us to clips of actors portraying Rocky Johnson and Ata Johnson, The Rock's parents, as well as portrayals of Andre the Giant, the Wild Samoans, the Iron Sheik, Ricky Steamboat, Randy Savage. And, this is presumably, we don't know if all of these characters will be referred to by their real gimmick names, or maybe they'll merely just be based on the characters or not named. We do know that Andre the Giant will be mentioned by name. You have to think that since this is an NBC show, and NBC is, WWE's kind of home network, owning USA. And
now more than ever
with Peacock, you would have to think that they would have the ability and the rights to these gimmick names and portray these characters, but I guess that's still another question mark for us.
Imagine not letting The Rock just do whatever he wants, though.
Well, that's true.
Well, WWE is promoting Young Rock. They were sharing the trailer on Twitter and everything the other day, so...
Yeah, I would imagine that if we're able to identify some of these, there's a Randy Savage guy, there's a Ricky Steamboat guy, I imagine that they'll be referring to them by name, perhaps. So still something that we have yet to see, but we will see once the show does premiere. We get a nice side-by-side of all three young actors portraying young Dwayne. There's a 10-year-old version, 15-year-old, and then an 18 to 20-year-old version. And then their respective time periods are 1982, 1987, and 1990. So I would assume 1990 to 92. So we're going to be in the 80s, the early 80s sometimes, the late 80s, early 90s. And we're just going to be bouncing between these three young actors as young Dwayne. And I actually really like that approach versus, we start with a really young Dwayne, and then maybe season 2, he's aged up a little bit, and then he's aged up a little bit. Number 1, because it allows all three actors to work on this show at the same time. Number 2, because it's just fun, for me at least, anytime you're watching like a biopic and you get to see different actors portray different ages. If it's cast well and if it's done well, the thing that comes to mind for me is, of course, the Jacksons in American Dream, because of course that would be what I go to immediately. But you had pre-Jackson 5 Michael, you had Jackson 5 era Michael, and then you had post-Jackson 5 into solo career and Jackson's Michael, and portrayed by three different actors, and all three of them I think did it really well. So I guess we'll see the portrayal of young Dwayne Johnson by these three different actors as we get into the show, but it seems like they'll kind of be coexisting in episodes together.
That's how the trailer makes it seem, that their stories are going to be interwoven. It's probably going to be a certain theme each episode that you can tie to 10-year-old Dwayne, 15-year-old Dwayne, and 18-year-old Dwayne.
I would imagine that we'll see a lot of parallels between what's going on in 82, 87, 90, and how The Rock over time learned these lessons and went from just a regular little boy, as he says, to, where he would he'd play football and then start training wrestling. So I would imagine that there will be parallels between all these different flashbacks.
And that's why I want to see what the importance of 1982 is. because I was wondering if his grandfather, who of course was a professional wrestler, Peter
Yes.
Maivia,
High Chief Peter Maivia. Yes.
if he was going to play any role. So I was like, when did he die? And it was in 1982, which is the youngest we're going to see Rock. So I'm wondering if that's going to be some sort of
I would imagine
catalyst.
that's a catalyst, yeah, for sure. Because with the entire theme being family, nothing is more
Right.
important than family. As you know, that is said later on in the trailer. I would imagine that would be a huge catalyst for, first of all, why we kick off in 1982. Second of all, just how The Rock frames this entire story, because his grandfather and his father, you know, they played a huge role in who he would eventually
course.
become. You know, even naming himself Rocky Maivia after both of them.
That went over well.
I don't know. I still like Rocky Maivia, but Flex Cavana, I think my favorite. The first actual dialogue clip of this show that we see is a clip of 10-year-old Dwayne trying to order alcoholic beverages at a restaurant with his parents. So immediately we see that he's just very precocious. He's the classic like sitcom kid, but it's The Rock, so you know he's actually going to be funny.
Well, this is like, they call it the wild and true story. That's what they're tagging this is. And I'm just like, how true to life will this really be? Is The Rock just going to make himself look like a cool 10-year-old? Was he really this cool?
Well, you know what?
Think of the turtleneck.
If anyone's going to be cool at 10 years old, I wouldn't put it past Dwayne Johnson to be the coolest 10-year-old around. But I mean, he does seem like he leads into the awkwardness of his teen years. I mean, we see 15-year-old Dwayne in high school dealing with the fact that he looks like an undercover cop with a full mustache, and, you know, his size, he's just a lot bigger than a lot of his classmates. We do see kind of the awkward years, and, you know, he yells out, you know, I'm 15 in the lunchroom and things like that. So there will probably be a lot of him leaning into, yeah, I thought I was really cool, but I turned out really awkward, and then I got into some trouble, and then, you know, eventually I figured things out.
Well, do we know that much about The Rock's life? Period.
Well, there is a fictionalized
Right.
autobiography that came out,
Right.
I want to say 99 or maybe 2000, called The Rock Says. And I wouldn't really take anything in that book as being the honest truth. It is.
Oh, no, we should read it.
It seems like the polar opposite of Mick Foley's first book, which was like so honest and vulnerable and just a really nice portrayal into Mick Foley's life. The Rock Says seemed to be just kind of fictionalized, you know, myths about The Rock from what I remember about it.
I never read it. We should read it and compare it to, the show.
Pro Wrestling Repackaged book
The
club.
book club.
So there we go. I know that's something you wanted to do anyway. So yeah, perhaps at some point we'll get our hands on a copy of The Rock Says.
I'll find it.
So we cut to 18-year-old Dwayne lifting weights at the University of Miami, which is then when we also get to see some of the interplay between Rocky Johnson and Dwayne, and maybe The Rock being a little bit embarrassed and maybe feeling like he has a little bit, you know, or quite a bit to live up to being an athlete, being the son of Rocky Johnson, and being a kid, you know, a blue chipper, as Jim Ross would say, with his size and as we would come to know, his charisma and his ability. But seems like there will be a lot of tension between Rocky Johnson and Dwayne, and, you know, a lot of it will be played for comedy like we see in this clip here, but it'll be interesting to see what The Rock has to say, you know, through this medium about his relationship with his father.
In interviews talking about the show, since the trailer came out, The Rock has said that he thinks his dad would have really loved the show. I assume the portrayal of him, so I assume it won't take too negative of a slant with his family.
Oh, no, I wouldn't imagine.
Yeah.
I think The Rock really reveres his family and his father, and it seems like he puts his family on a pedestal, and rightfully so. You know, his family is wrestling royalty. You know, the importance of his father and Tony Atlas, their tag team in that day, you know, very influential and important Black wrestlers at a time.
They were the first to hold championships.
Rocky Johnson, for how big The Rock is, Rocky Johnson isn't necessarily a household name. So that's an important part of this show, is also educating the audience on kind of the landscape of wrestling at that time, as many wrestling fans now, or even just casual TV viewers, might not know, but also not going so hardcore in depth into it, because this is not a show that's about old school wrestling. It's a show about a family, and one man in particular and his kind of journey, but it's about his family, and wrestling happens to be a huge part of that family. So interesting to see the balance between kind of the wrestling history aspect and who we get introduced to, I imagine that the Wild Samoans, will be a big part of Afa and Sika will be a big part of the story. We see clips of Dwayne's family and his dad's wrestling buddies. And again, The Rock's voiceover is just putting a lot of emphasis on these lessons that he learned growing up surrounded by wrestlers.
And he comes from a family with strong women. So I imagine that will play some role. He seems, his mother is she still comes to wrestling shows.
Yeah.
She'll be in the crowd because her family's still involved with wrestling. And during this time period that it's covering, his grandmother was the one who was in charge of a whole wrestling promotion. Mm-hmm. So I think that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, things that the average person would not know and would probably come away from going, oh my God, wow, this is the Anawai family. It has such deep roots. So that being a big aspect of the show is something that, it'll be a history lesson, but it'll also kind of enhance everyone's appreciation, I think, of The Rock and where he came from and the kind of expectations that might have been on him and how he would have had to exceed everyone by how gigantic he eventually became. We have a clip of Dwayne's mom, Ata, saying nothing is more important than family, as we mentioned before. So the emphasis on the concept of family and where you come from, playing a lot into the narrative of the show. We see a card game going on with Rocky Johnson and a bunch of his wrestling buddies. And there's a 10-year-old Dwayne sitting off to the side. And he says, it's all fake anyways. And then a hush falls over the card table and they all look at him before Rocky Johnson starts to go, oh, I didn't raise him like that. And, oh, he's a special boy and things like that. So it'll be just fun to see a group of these old school wrestlers, as we mentioned before, the Iron Sheik, Randy Savage, Andre the Giant, the Wild Samoans. I think it's just going to be a lot of fun to see all of these portrayals. Although I know there is one in particular that you are not a big fan of, just based on what you've seen so far.
I just did not like how Andre the Giant looked. Something about him. I don't know what it is. Did he look too thin?
Maybe.
I think he looks too thin.
I mean, Andre the Giant is just a hard person to cast for.
Who can you get?
Who are
the
you
Big
going
Show?
To get? I think it's a good enough. If I looked at the guy and said, okay, he's supposed to be Andre the Giant, I think it's decent enough.
From the neck up, 100% looks like him. But maybe I'm just familiar with 1980s Andre the Giant, later 80s Andre the Giant. So maybe 1982 Andre the Giant looked thinner. I don't know. But something about it just doesn't sit right.
So we see a graphic that says, even the world's biggest star started out small. So a lot of this is going to be self-deprecating humor about himself, The Rock having a sense of humor about himself, but also, and he's mentioned this in interviews, wanting to be vulnerable about, he wasn't always The Rock. He wasn't always the world's biggest star. He wasn't always this, very impressive looking man, making himself more relatable and saying, hey, listen, maybe don't put me on this giant pedestal unless you want to vote for me to become president. But I was just a little kid. I was just a regular kid who was born into these very interesting circumstances. And this is what happened.
That's another interesting element because he is in the show running for president. So how dirty are we going to see The Rock get? Because if he's telling his story and he wants you to vote for him, how dark are we going to get with that? How real?
Well, it'd be interesting to see if part of the show is his opponent's mudslinging campaign, bringing up all of the dirt and him having to own up to that and talk about that and be open about that and put himself in a vulnerable place that I don't think we've ever really seen The Rock put himself in before. So yeah, I'm very excited to see how they will handle a lot of that. We do get a shot of Rosario Dawson's character, as we mentioned earlier, and she's going to be playing a character named General Monica Jackson, who is, quote, a resilient leader, confident and steadfast in her decisions. Representative of her decorated years of service, General Jackson is an unrivaled force whose respected ethics and values are introduced as a very integral key to Dwayne Johnson's presidential campaign. And that, again, is from the Entertainment Weekly article that I mentioned earlier. Rosario Dawson, I am a big fan of. And when I heard of her casting, when I learned that she was going to be cast in this show as a main character, I was very excited because I loved her on all the Marvel Netflix series. She was arguably the best part of a lot of those shows because she was on all of them. And I'm a big fan of hers in general, so I'm very excited to see what she brings to this show. You know nothing about her, so you have zero thoughts.
I don't think I've ever seen her in anything. I know that she is in a relationship with Cory Booker, who ran for president.
Interesting. Very cool.
My favorite vegan politician.
So we're coming to the end of the trailer here, and The Rock says, "I've had one hell of a life. There's still so much that I have to share with the world. Oh, and I've got some pretty cool stories about Andre the Giant." And then cut to Andre storming into 10-year-old Rock's career day at school as the kids just scream in horror. And a fireman who also gets scared. And we end with a series of photos of Dwayne Johnson at various periods of his life with various looks. I know the looks are an aspect of the show that you are particularly excited about.
I can't wait to see what we see 15 and 18-year-old Dwayne wear. I mean, we've seen pictures of the actor, I think the one who's playing 18-year-old Rock, wearing the turtleneck, the chain, the fanny pack. But what other Rock looks are we going to see? I
could only imagine.
This is why we need a season 2, because I want to see someone wearing like the nonsense that he wore as The Rock in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Like those weird
the $500 shirts.
Yes.
And yeah. I mean, and that's another thing. It's like, well, how long will this show go? Are they planning for multiple seasons? I know The Rock mentioned it'd be nice to get renewed, but if this show goes for like 4 or 5 seasons, then we're starting to get into, all right, well, is he training to be a wrestler at some point? Is he getting signed? Do we end with his debut at Survivor Series 96? Like how far?
Hair.
All the various states of hair, his Kramer hair. How far are they going to go? That's I think one of the most intriguing things about this show is just seeing like, all right, so how far are we going to go? So we know we're in 82, 87, and 90. Mm-hmm. So if we get renewed for season 2, will those all kind of shift up a few years? How would they deal with that? What would the time jump be?
I mean, you could also go backwards. We start with him at 10. What was pre-10-year-old Rock doing?
So then we're really getting into Pebble territory, I think.
I bet he was doing some weird stuff then, though, too.
I think The Rock's doing weird stuff at all times, all the time, no matter what age he is. But that's the great thing about The Rock. He's always involved in something. He's always doing something. He's had his reality shows, Titan Games, and whether or not we take a look at everything that he necessarily does on this podcast is there might be a bit too much, but young Rock is definitely in our wheelhouse. And I think we're both very excited and very interested in this series.
It still feels like a Funny or Die sketch. It's like, I still can't believe that it's really happening. I mean, obviously it's happening, but is it?
Personally, I doubted that this show would make it to series, not because of anyone involved or anything, just because it's like young Rock. I immediately thought of like young Sheldon.
Oh.
And it just seemed kind of like a joke type of thing. Like a Funny or Die type of premise, a joke trailer like that parody Fresh Prince gritty reboot trailer, but then that actually got greenlit for a series, and now that's in development. So it's weird that sometimes these kind of joke premises, these things that seem outlandish, actually wind up going to series and becoming a thing. I mean, the thing that it immediately made me think of when I first saw the first teaser was like, I remembered when I saw the original trailer for Cobra Kai. And I'm a big Karate Kid fan. At that point, I'm like, I don't know about this. This seems like it's kind of a joke. And then I went into that show thinking, this is probably going to be kind of a joke, maybe a riff. The creators of the show were involved in Hot Tub Time Machine and Harold and Kumar. This is probably going to be just a straight comedy, kind of a parody type of thing. And then it turned out to be everything that I would have wanted from a Karate Kid sequel show, and it's now my favorite show, period. So I do have high expectations for this show, and kind of high hopes, maybe a better word, because this series is created by Nahnatchka Khan, who is also the creator of Fresh Off the Boat and Don't Trust the Bitch in Apartment 23. And she also directed the movie Always Be My Maybe, it was a big movie when that came out. She's involved in some very successful projects at this point. And, she's also been a great champion of representation in TV and film. She's Iranian American, so her hero growing up was the Iron Sheik.
So she appears to, in some way, also be a wrestling fan, even if it was just her as a child watching wrestling. So you would imagine that she's kind of going to approach that subject with respect.
It must be really cool for her because the Iron Sheik obviously plays a part in this. We see an actor portraying him, and the Iron Sheik was one of the few representations of Middle Eastern culture in entertainment at that time.
Portrayed as a bad guy, though, of course.
but from her perspective, it's like, oh, well, he's always the underdog to this Hulk Hogan who just demolishes everyone. So from her perspective, and that's her hero growing up. So that must have been so fun for her to have this show now where she's working with Dwayne Johnson, who is the son of Rocky Johnson, who was around at the time that her hero, the Iron Sheik, was wrestling. So very cool there. I'm very excited just in general with who is behind this show and the fact that, you know, The Rock doesn't have to do these projects. The Rock doesn't have to do a TV show about his younger years, but he wants to, and that passion is there. The Rock doesn't have to work again a day in his life, but he wants to do this. So I feel that passion is what's going to make this not just some stupid, oh yeah, it's The Rock cashing in. And, you know, I think we're in for a fun show and a heartfelt show.
Yeah, if this was like Stone Cold Steve Austin, if we were watching young Stone Cold.
Well, wait a minute now, because...
Is that happening?
Oh, man. Now, all right, here's the idea. NBC create a shared universe of fictional shows with depictions of young Rock, young Austin, who else could we do? Young Undertaker, young Mick Foley, and let's go for it,
young
man.
Triple H. How would you do that with the nose?
Incredibly rude of you to say that on a podcast. I don't know who you think you are. But no, there's nothing more that I would love than to see a young Steve Austin growing up at 316 Gimmick Street. His parents struggling to pay these things that come in the mail called bills. Oh man, I would love to see that. But no, that would be interesting if he eventually crosses paths, if, you know, we get far enough into the show, if he eventually crosses paths with, you know, some of his contemporaries that might have been coming up in the business at the time. So that's another aspect that would be fun.
10-year-old Rock and 10-year-old Goldust crossing paths.
That would be fun. Well, so maybe like an Owen Hart.
Oh yeah.
Like an Owen Hart
of course, because The Rock's dad is Canadian.
Yeah.
So
that would be interesting. Yeah, I'd love to see them go all the way up to him, you know, wrestling in USWA, and then maybe go all the way up, like I said, to that debut at Survivor Series 96. I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see how well this show does. I mean, if enough wrestling fans tune in, and we know that wrestling fans, you know, they will support these projects, you know, that they're interested in. So if enough wrestling fans tune in, I guess the sky's the limit for young Rock.
I don't think The Rock's going to produce something, especially about himself, that's going to be bad.
Yeah, he's not going to half-ass it.
It looks good, so I have high hopes, and I hope I'm not disappointed, or The Rock's going to hear about it.
Oh, certainly he will hear about it if he subscribes to Pro Wrestling Repackaged. But speaking of which, that will do it for this introductory episode of Pro Wrestling Repackaged. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you will continue to join us for the rest of Season 1 of Young Rock. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at PWRepackaged and email us at pwrepackaged@gmail.com. Subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. And you can visit pwrepackaged.crd.co for links to everything. If you'd like to support the show, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or any other platform that allows reviews. Pro Wrestling Repackaged is a Multitrack Minds production. Visit multitrackminds.com for projects and audio production services by yours truly. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.